Are you planning a trip to Puglia and Matera? In this video, we'll show you the top 10 things to see and do in amazing Matera. Andiamo!
Today we're visiting Matera, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the world, going back to the Paleolithic era, so about 9,000 years ago.
Located in the region of Basilicata in southern Italy, Matera is famous for its cave dwellings, which were inhabited up until the 1950s. At one time, it was an important city on the Appian Way between Rome and Brindisi, but it declined over the centuries, and by the 20th century it became known as the Vergogna Nazionale, or the shame of Italy, because the people were living in abject poverty and they were ravaged by starvation and disease.
This led to a forced relocation of its inhabitants to modern housing. 30 years later, efforts to preserve and restore the Sassi began, leading to its designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1993. This recognition spurred a renaissance, transforming Matera into a symbol of cultural revival and architectural preservation.
It's amazing to me to think that people have lived here for over 10,000 years. You may have heard the term troglodyte used as a derogatory description for someone who's primitive or unsophisticated, but the word actually means cave dweller. And the inhabitants of Matera were real-life troglodytes, and the present-day residents wear that moniker proudly.
The first thing on our list of things to do in Matera is to stay in a cave. After all, Matera is famous for its ancient cave dwellings, and so it's interesting to try to imagine yourself living as people did in those days. Here's our bed, and then as we move around the room, you can see that we are built into a cave. The ceiling is kind of vaulted. And then we have a desk and a sitting area. And then over here, we have our shower. Now let's look at the shower. It's kind of cool. When you go in here, it's definitely in a cave. Here's our bathroom, other than the shower.
We just visited Casa Grota, which is a museum that illustrates how people lived here, certainly the centuries before that it was abandoned. In fact, somebody lived here until 1956.
I think it's a fascinating example of a traditional cave dwelling, and it really gives you a good idea of what life was like for Matera's population. This one is now furnished as it would have been when it was inhabited.
Entire families lived in 1 or 2 room caves together with their animals. A small kitchen might be carved into a corner and a makeshift donkey stall in another corner. The parents slept in the bed while the children slept in cradles or dresser drawers. They had no plumbing or electricity, and the entire family ate standing up out of one large dish in the center of a small table.
It's really quite eye-opening to see how people lived until just a few decades ago. Nothing like the cute B&Bs these caves have been transformed into.
It's really a fascinating place, and I think it's important to see something like this to understand really what Matera is about and why it's worth coming here to see the town and how people live.
We are at the Belvedere Luigi Guericchio, one of the Belvedere or viewpoints in Matera where you can look out over the view. In this particular one, you can see the Duomo in the distance. In some of the other Belvedere, what you can see is the other side of the gorge, the Sasso on the other side, where you can see the actual cave dwellings that are cut into the rock, where people used to live up until the 1950s.
When you look out over the city and the surrounding area, you feel as though you've been transported back in time. No wonder it's been used as a backdrop for several biblical movies such as Ben-Hur and Passion of Christ and Pasolini's The Gospel According to St. Matthew.
One of the really interesting things about Matera are the chiese rupestre, or the cave churches. At one time, there were about 150 churches cut into the rocks, the caves. And some of them are still there today, and they're really interesting to see. And they date back from the Middle Ages. Some of them have some beautiful frescoes that are well preserved. So really worth seeing and very different than the normal churches you see when you travel around Italy.
We're in a cave which once was the Church of San Biagio. It was used as a church until at least 1640 when they then built the new church, which is up out of the cave because it was too humid in here to preserve the artwork. After it was not used as a church, it was turned into a cantina with a wine press with one of the cave dwellings that we've talked about. We just visited the church of Madonna dei Idris.
It's another cave church that dates back to the 15th century and is part of the complex that contains an old crypt, which has important and well-preserved frescoes dating back to the Middle Ages.
We just came out of the Palombaro Lungo.
It's a giant subterranean cistern where they used to store water for the city.
It was excavated back in the 16th century for the purpose of collecting rainwater for use by Matera's residents through a network of fountains and wells, and it holds over 1 million gallons of water. But it's no longer used for its original purpose. Now it's a tourist attraction and a great place to get out of the heat in the dead of summer.
Right now, we're in the Museo Laboratorio di Civiltà Contadina, or the Museum of Peasant Life. And in addition to showing us the types of housing that they lived in that we've seen in some of the other museums, this one also includes the workshops of various tradespeople. So we have a cobbler, a blacksmith, a tanner, a barber, a seamstress, and many other trades represented in different rooms. It's really cool because you can really see what the people did, how they worked, where they worked, and the tools that they used. So interestingly, one of the rooms was labeled La Breve Infanzia, or the short childhood. And that probably referred to both the fact that there was a 50% mortality rate among children, and even if the child lived, they would probably be put to work at a very, very young age. So while there was a room with some toys in it, I don't think the kids had much opportunity to use them once they got to be about 4 years old.
We just visited the Museum of Olive Oil in a caverna in the rocks. It's originally was from hundreds of years ago, and they have examples of the machinery they used that was operated by laborers who lived here 24 hours a day for the whole pressing period, which was like 5 or 6 months, in what were miserable working conditions. It was very labor intensive. Can't even imagine doing that amount of work. But it's an interesting place to visit because it shows you the process of how the olives are pressed, the oil is produced, it's separated, and then you get the final product of the olive oil. In addition to all the workmen that were there, the animals that helped turn the press live there as well. So you had a very small environment with animals and men working most of the time. It was extremely hot in there, apparently like nearly 100 degrees because of all of that in such a small space.
Unlike the many rustic cave churches in the area, the Duomo is a formal cathedral dating back to 1270. It is perched on the ridge that forms the highest point of the city of Matera and divides the two Sassi.
Though originally built in the Apulian Romanesque style, much of the interior got a Baroque-style makeover in the 17th and 18th centuries.
One of the very best things to do in Matera is to just get lost and wander. It's not hard to get lost because your GPS will wonder where you are when you get into this maze and these labyrinth of streets and alleys and passageways. You'll go up and down a lot. You'll discover a lot of restaurants and shops and artisan workshops and cafes. It's just a really great way to immerse yourself in the town.
We'd consider it a must-see if you come to southern Italy because it's really a fascinating place, very different than any of the other places we've ever been.
And amazingly, it is not as crowded with tourists as a lot of the other popular areas. Matera actually was not quite as crowded as we expected. Now, there were tourists and there were school groups on tours. But Matera is much more spread out than some of those other locations, and maybe that's why it didn't seem crowded. But it was nice and refreshing that we could actually make our way and see all the things without fighting through the crowds.
Very true.
Our advice to you, if you come to Matera, is to try to stay overnight, at least one night. Now, you can definitely see Matera in just a day if you need to. But we encourage you to stay overnight because it's early in the morning and later in the afternoon and the evening, when the tour groups have left, that the town is quieter and it's mostly the residents that are there. And you can really kind of immerse yourself in the town and feel what it would be like to live there. Also, if you stay overnight, then you're not as rushed because there are a lot of things to see, but it is spread out. And we found that with just a day, we were just a little bit rushed.
We just had a day and a little bit, and we would have liked to have more because there were some things we wanted to do that we didn't have time for. There's some nice hikes across the valley, which would give you a view back to the town. And there's the aqueduct that was in the James Bond No Time to Die, where Bond jumps off dramatically. A practical tip or something you ought to be aware of is it's a very hilly town and it's spread out more than some other places. So there are a lot of stairs, a lot of sloping paths. If you have trouble getting around, it can be a difficult place to visit. I had a knee replacement just 2 months ago, and for me it was a bit of a challenge to go up and down all these hills and the stairs. Certainly doable and worth it for me, but something you just ought to be aware of before you come.
It was actually great physical therapy for him. His PT guy would be very proud of him going up and down all those stairs.
Mm-hmm.